Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. If you're watching this show, you have lived through America's unipolar moment. After the end of the Cold War, the United States was the world's dominant power, a real hegemon. Today, it's still the world's top superpower, but it feels like there's a viable challenger in the form of China. And perhaps more importantly, countries around the world are increasingly hedging their bets, acting like there's a shift underway, that the unipolar era might be over. In a moment, I will speak with a scholar who says Donald Trump is the first post-unipolar American president, and she has a plan for how US foreign policy should evolve. If this is your first time joining us on FP Live, welcome. We will take some subscriber questions as always. And if you would like to join in, use the code FP Live for a discount. An FP subscription also gets you access to our magazine, of course, and all the essays and articles we publish. We are also a podcast. Just look for FP Live on your favorite audio platform. I said the world might be in a post-unipolar moment. What I didn't say is if we've entered a new era. We don't know, at least not yet. We also don't know how long this seeming interregnum will last. Well, my guest today charts out how we got here and how Washington should navigate the period that lies ahead in a great new book. It is called First Among Equals, US Foreign Policy in a Multipolar World, and its author is Emma Ashford, an FP columnist and senior fellow at the Stimson Center. Emma, welcome back to FP Live.
Thanks so much for having me today.
Congrats on the book. So you declare on page 1, the old world is dead. What does that mean?
So I would not take credit for that insight. I would probably point to Gramsci, who I'm quoting, Antonio Gramsci, back in the 1930s. He was an Italian communist. People know him best, I think, for developing the word hegemony. But what he wrote while he was in prison was a book in which he basically talked about the ways in which the old world was dead, but the new hadn't yet been born. So by that, what he meant was everybody accepted that the political structures, the institutions that had characterized politics in Italy and in Europe up to that point, that those weren't working anymore. But something new hadn't yet emerged, right? Elites were casting around for something, inertia was carrying people forward, but there wasn't yet a new structure, a new order. And that is what I think is happening in international politics today. We have moved past this unipolar period of unchallenged US dominance. We're heading for something new, but we're still in the transition phase of figuring out what that new world looks like.
And when you describe Trump as the first post-unipolar president, what does that mean? And do you think he knows that?
I think some of it is actually about his intention or the way he expresses US interests. So, if we're going to talk about data and trends, then you can start making all kinds of arguments about when the unipolar moment ends, from the financial crisis in 2008 all the way up to the war in Ukraine or beyond. But if we are talking instead about US policymakers accepting this or understanding this, I think you can make a case that Trump and his administration are basically the first since at least the 1990s to accept that America is no longer this indispensable nation. America may still be very powerful, may still be the top dog, but we don't control everything. We're not trying to transform the world anymore. And to me, that's a fundamental shift in opinion that makes them quite different than their predecessors.
And so, how do we characterize the moment we're currently in? I think you've used the term unbalanced multipolarity. What does that mean, and how does it make sense of the moment we're in?
There's been this huge debate among sort of IR scholars and foreign policy folks in DC about polarity and right, are we entering a bipolar world? Is it US and China? Are we entering a multipolar world with lots of powers? Is the US still unchallenged? Unipolarity? It all gets a little academic, but the point that I would make is the US certainly is no longer unchallenged. China is rising to meet the United States. The US is not in decline, but it is in what we might call relative decline. That is to say, again, other states are rising to meet it. And there is this growing cohort of middle states, right? Everything from European states to Indonesia or Nigeria or South Africa or Brazil, that are playing bigger roles in their region, independent of the United States. And so for me, what I see when I look at all this data, military, economic, technological, etc., is that the US and China, they're out ahead of the pack, but there are a lot of other important countries, and that I think is what scholars would call unbalanced multipolarity.
And so to be clear here, not bipolar, partly because of the rise of the rest.
Exactly. I think if you look at, again, you can look at lots of different data and draw different conclusions. It's very much a cherry picking exercise, unfortunately. But if you look at the sort of abundance of power resources that states hold, whether that's military power, economic power, what you see is the US and China do have a lot today. But if you compare them to, say, the US and the Soviet Union in the 1950s, it's not nearly as much. The rest, everybody other than the US and China, are now making up more of that global power balance. And so to me, that's an interesting and different feature than we would have had during this bipolar Cold War.
I thought it was interesting how you came up with this idea of four tribes in Washington to try and make sense of what America should do in this new world that you're describing. And these four tribes have four visions. And I'm just going to name them quickly. The America First hawks. You've got the proponents of liberal primacy. You've got progressive world builders. And then finally, you've got the realists and the restrainers. You've sort of bucketed them into one group. Just very quickly, in a sentence each, can you describe what these four groups are?
So the thing that I talk about in the book is that we're having these foreign policy debates. It's not just because of all those trends and shifting power dynamics. It's also partly there have been these failures of the unipolar moment. But what that has done is really break open foreign policy debate in Washington. I think that's visible to anyone watching. So I sort of looked around and tried to categorize the arguments that I found around me, not necessarily in terms of old academic grand strategy debates, but what are people actually arguing today? And as you say, I came up with these sort of four options. Two of them should be more familiar than others, the America First hawks, which resemble fairly closely the Trump administration, nationalistic, focused on sovereignty, very unilateral, inward looking, willing to use military force. The liberal order folks, the liberal internationalists, that's the Biden administration, right? They care about the US role in the world, but mostly in terms of preserving order and institutions, the things the US has relied on for years. So they're they're not revisionist. They're actually very much trying to sustain what they think the US is losing. Last two groups are less influential in the policymaking process, but you can still see their influence. One is this progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and they are both more dovish than the other two groups, and also with extremely ambitious goals for how they might bring about a more peaceful world through fighting autocracy or kleptocracy or all of these things. And then there's the group of realist restrainers, which I would probably bracket myself in that group, who again, somewhat more dovish, more cautious about the use of military force, worry about stumbling into great power conflict, but also that they are inclined towards seeing the US in the national interests. It's not about making the world a better place, it's about living with the world as it is. So happy to talk more about any of those groups, but that is, I think, in a nutshell, the differences.
Well, I definitely want to focus on that last group in large part because you sort of subscribe to that school and are a leading proponent of at least one part of it. But before we do that, which of these four schools do you think is sort of in the ascendancy right now, or that gets to shape most of the way US foreign policy currently works?
It's a really tough question. I mean, I would say that there are sort of two schools influencing the Trump administration for the most part. And that is the realist restrainers, but perhaps more so these America First hawks. And I think a lot of the issues that we've seen the Trump administration engage in sort of this tug of war on, right? Whether it's Ukraine or Europe or other issues, it's between those two groups and how sort of forward leaning on force the US is. But at the same time, I would also caution against saying that's necessarily the direction of US foreign policy, because that is, this very fairly nationalist visions of foreign policy. And over on the other side, we have Democrats trying to figure out what their foreign policy is. And that debate looks much more internationalist, and it really hasn't solidified yet. So just a sort of a word of caution about drawing too much from the current administration.